Hello and welcome to today's meeting of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Project for Saturday, June 25th. Following last weekend's Schiller Institute conference, there can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. The Schiller Institute will co-opt this coming 4th of July weekend in order to present the LaRouche New Bretton Woods proposal as the core content of a world development architecture. Now, we will be discussing over the course of the next hour or so what the New Bretton Woods is. But the special presentation that will be given next week will be on Sunday, July 3rd at 1 p.m. And it will be Helga Zepp-LaRouche, as well independent U.S. Senate candidate Diane Stayer is also invited to speak. Others may participate as well. To say more both about last weekend's conference and the upcoming necessity for the upcoming meeting, we're going to show a video from yesterday's webcast interview with Helga Zepp-LaRouche done by our speaker for today, Harley Schlanger.
Hello and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. I'm Harley Schlanger. It's June 24th, 2022. And we've just come from last weekend's extraordinary Schiller Institute conference on the need for a global bankruptcy reorganization to break from the dying transatlantic financial system. Helga, this was, I think there were 31 speakers from 12 countries, covered a lot of topics, but especially drove home the point that we need a new financial and new security architecture. Wonder if you would like to give us your sense of what came out of the conference, because obviously there's a lot of work to do now.
Well, I think the conference was indeed very important and powerful and is being recognized as such by an increasing number of people around the world. For example, in the first panel, the strategic panel, we had the leaders of two of the most important think tanks from Russia and China. One was Dr. Kotonov from the RIAC, Russian International Affairs Council, which is a think tank associated with the Foreign Ministry. And from China, we had the dean of the Chongyang Financial Institute of the Renmin University, Dr. Wang Wen. And both of them gave a very important and very different view than you hear from the mainstream media about how they judge the strategic situation. And then we had a whole variety of very important speakers, Sam Pitroda, former Indian minister, but also speakers who spoke on the situation in China, otherwise in Afghanistan. And so this was a very important debate, because once you cannot discuss different points of views, then you're a victim of a narrative, and narrative and truth are two very different things. Then we had an excellent economic panel discussing, the actual condition of the world economy, a very enlightening science panel, and a beautiful, beautiful cultural panel where we had absolute pearls, like, for example, a video of the late singer William Warfield singing Zwei Grenadiere, which, given the fact that the war hysteria is right now trying to convince people of all kinds of things, was a very timely intervention. So I would encourage people to watch this conference, because, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that this is the kind of all-around discussion you have a very hard time finding anywhere else but with the Schiller Institute. But I think most important was what came out in terms of a discussion that, one has to investigate why is the war danger so acute. And that is naturally something which is not being discussed by even people who oppose the war. But the real reason for the war danger is the fact that the transatlantic neoliberal financial system is completely out of control. I mean, you can see that with all kinds of aspects. You see it with the runaway inflation in food and gasoline, energy prices in general. But you also see it in an unbelievable collapse of supply lines, of breakdown of, the simplest functions of different parts of the economy. For example, in Germany, wagons of trains are being put on a side track for days. And then naturally the just-in-time does not function. The semi-finished products are not arriving. So, we just agreed out of this conference to issue a call to address that, because it's very clear that the Western governments are not doing anything to remedy the inflation or any of the other hardships. And if you look, the absolute bungling of the German, I really hate to call him economic minister, because he's actually a deconstructionist minister rather than an economic minister. But in any case, he is now causing quite some hysteria by saying, there soon has to be rationing of the gas. He already called the second level of alarm on energy emergency. There is now a big debate in these circles if one should supply the own industry in the coming fall and winter, or keep exporting 35% of the natural gas imported from Russia to the neighbors, which is in contracts, existing contracts. In any case, this is all absolutely are all symptoms that the neoliberal model is completely bankrupt. As a matter of fact, even if nobody in the mainstream politics or media would say that, but I'm saying it, that the neoliberal system is as bankrupt as the communist system was between 89 and 91. And what you now see is the bill which is being presented for all the mistakes of this neoliberal system. For example, outsourcing into cheap labor markets, which was for a very long time a source of big profit. It led to the destruction of highly productive jobs in the industrialized countries and the exploitation of the labor force in the developing countries. This is now, it shows that this was wrong, because now the supply lines don't function. In the same way, this whole idea of going to the stock exchange, money makes money, shareholder value society. If you look at the result of it, you can see that the billionaires became more and richer, more millionaires, but the large parts of the population has become poorer. The middle level class is almost not existent. The low end of the income bracket, people can't make ends meet anymore. So this system is absolutely bankrupt, and the central banks right now are caught between a rock and a hard place, because they have now started to increase the interest rate in order to fight the inflation. But that risks immediately a chain reaction of bankruptcies from highly indebted firms, from emerging markets who suffer capital flight because of the interest rate policy of the central banks of the so-called advanced sector. And this will not get better within this system. You need a complete reorganization of this system. Essentially the same thing what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in 1933. And therefore we have issued now this call to have an emergency conference for New Bretton Woods, and we are collecting signatures. So I'm actually calling on you, our viewers, please sign this call, and not only sign it if you agree with it naturally, but circulate it widely, because this is urgent. This is not something for the long term, but action must be taken very soon.
If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche organization. Next Sunday, on Saturday, July 3rd, we are going to co-opt the occasion of the July 4th holiday to highlight the current action that has to be taken to establish this new Bretton Woods system, which you just heard Ms. Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, discuss. The late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, whose 100th birthday would have been this coming September 8th, often talked about the idea of agency in history. He pointed out that agency in history, including the agency of governments, is often erroneously attributed, for example, to some momentary highlighted reaction to a current events, rather than the longer-term actions being committed in the larger time frame of current history. You see that right now in the case of the so-called Ukraine-Russia war, which has nothing to do with the events that apparently occurred during February 24th or just before February 24th or anything like that. What we've done is we've pulled a portion of a presentation that Mr. LaRouche gave in May of 2001, months before September 11th, about 2.5 months before September 11th, in which he was describing what he called the Nietzschean character of the presidency of George Walker Bush, Bush 43 at the time, and he was describing the character of their approach to policy and what the nature was of what was actually to be in store. And we supply this because there's a discussion that will be engaged in a few minutes in terms of what will be done or what can be done to actually reverse this mentality, this mental outlook that not only plagues the American presidency, but the American people, whether that's exhibited in the forms of mass shootings or in the forms of other kinds of activity. The point of the thing is to try to get on top of how agency actually happens as opposed to the popular view of it. So we now offer you this video from Lyndon LaRouche from May of 2001.
What is at stake at present is the attempt by an international oligarchy, which is largely centered among the five thieves, that is, the four kingdoms controlled, major kingdoms controlled by the British monarchy, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and the associate member of the British Commonwealth, the United States, to have the oligarchical powers of these combined powers establish a de facto world dictatorship by methods of terrorism, by methods of intimidation, by using the threat of what remains of military power in the world to try to intimidate the world into capitulating to this kind of dictatorship. It was very much like Hitler in the bunker, but George Bush went into the White House as Hitler in the bunker from the beginning. He didn't have to wait all those years to get in the bunker. So what you face is an attempt to intimidate the world into submission to something that the world doesn't like, out of pure fear. And to understand what is going to happen in the United States, all those fools who thought that maybe they could deal with Bush, that maybe Bush was just a change for a different flavor from a Clinton administration, were fools. And many parts of the world thought we can work with Bush. Many people in Europe said we can work with Bush. Oh, we know Rumsfeld. We know Cheney from the old days. We can reach them. We can influence them. Yes, Bush is crazy, but we'll work together with these people we know. They'll come around. They'll help us deal with this situation. Don't worry, it's going to be under control. It's not going to be under control. Bush is a perfect fascist. We don't have a fascist regime yet in the United States, but we have a fascist party in power within the Republican Party, represented by a president who's an integral part of that. This man is a Nietzschean personality, and if you watch some of the things that he's done and his administration has done, they do not consider the consequences of their actions. What they have done as financial emergency actions was stupid. Absolutely stupid. What they have done will make everything worse. They will not control anything. They will make nothing better. They will control nothing. We're in the period where this Nietzschean triumph of the will, like an Adolf Hitler Nuremberg rally, is the characteristic, the mental state of the President of the United States, to the extent he has a mental state, and is the mental state of his Attorney General, or the Falwells, or the Robertsons, you know. these religious fanatics who are not Christians or anything else. They're just fanatics. This is a fascist movement. The theory of government in the United States, as typified by the decision of the Supreme Court majority, is fascist. It is the mentality of the Carl Schmitt in Germany, whose influence on law designed the Notverordnung that made Hitler a dictator in Germany. This is their mentality. Their mentality is that of Hegel, who was the first philosopher of fascism in modern Europe, who used the case of the Napoleon model to write a theory of the state, which was then copied by Carl Schmitt for Schmitt's doctrine. Now, in the United States, as a friend of ours, now deceased, Professor von der Heide pointed out, the danger of fascism from the types like Bush and his father in the United States is worse than the danger of fascism from Hitler in Germany. Because in the case of Germany, the Nazis were constrained by the powerful influence of a cultural restraint. They did not dare attack the German culture openly. And that imposed a limitation on Hitler's freedom for action. In the end, it didn't make much difference, but it was different. In the United States, the dominant ideology is radical positivism, which is the perfect ideal for fascism. Fascism in the United States would be worse than we have seen in any part of the world unless we stop it. Because there are no constraints. There is no cultural constraint, no limit. And this group was put in to establish a Roman Empire of a new type. A globalized empire. So this is what we face. We have the worst financial crisis in world history. We have a crisis in which the ruling financial powers of this world are doomed. There's nothing that can save them. There's nothing that can save this system. It's finished. It's over. But nonetheless, they're determined that if they die, everybody else will die first. And therefore, they will do what they can to enslave the world into meeting their conditions, their financial and economic and other conditionalities, and to overthrow every government that they don't like, to manage the world by causing wars and threat of wars and incidents. Their policy is one of global crisis management, including the deliberate provocation and launching of wars. So therefore, we come to a point of crisis. What is the alternative to sitting back and either pretending this isn't happening or to simply complain about it's happening and protest wildly? Humanity is different than animals. Animals, under these conditions, would simply go crazy. But except for some of my opponents, human beings are not animals. Human beings are cognitive. And the characteristic of history is that when mankind uses his brain, his mind, and exchanges concepts with others, which define an alternative to an impossible situation, mankind will adopt an intention, a governing intention of action, to make some innovation in institutions to try to solve the problem. Therefore, the most essential thing at this point is ideas. Ideas are the distinction between man and beast in any case. The cognitive powers of mind are the distinction between man and beast. And it's by addressing, in times of crisis especially, confronting mankind with the crisis, encouraging them to face the reality that the impossible is about to descend upon them, making it clear. But that's not enough. You also have to provide a clear image of the feasible alternative. What do we do instead? Once we have a population whose leadership organic leadership has a clear idea of what to do about the crisis, then the fact that the majority of the human race has an interest in those ideas gives leaders who represent those ideas the ability to transform institutions, especially institutions which are controlled by a tyrannical minority, whose actions are contrary to the vital interests of the human species. And therefore, the most important concept at this point is not exactly a new concept, but a fresh vision of an old one. This is a concept which Helga will address in her address tomorrow on the source of the idea of the modern nation state. And the characteristic feature of the modern sovereign nation state, for which there was a long struggle in Europe and which came into being for the first time in the 15th century, was the notion that there is no legitimate government except government which is efficiently committed to what is called the common good or the general welfare. This is the principle on which the United States Constitution is based, the principle of the general welfare. It's a concept which is reflected in the leading 3 paragraphs of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. It is a concept for which man has fought. It is the concept which His Holiness Pope John II has affirmed in the past 2 weeks in a new statement on the anniversary of an old papal decree. The concept of the general welfare, that man is a special creature, unlike the animals, given a cognitive power, a creative power, and that man must be defended on principle because man is of this quality. And there is no alternative to defending that kind of human nature for all people and their posterity. It's the only basis of law on which we can be governed. It's the only basis in law, in concept, by which you can lead this aching, imperiled world out of the tragedy it's now embroiled in and lead it to a place of safety.
And that is the intent of our meeting next Sunday, July 3rd, which will be discussing the concept, the LaRouche concept of the new Bretton Woods system, or in other words, the alternative to the Green New Deal, the inflation, and the various kinds of debacles through war that we've had our country submitted to, and the world submitted through this nation for many, many years. To discuss this and to discuss some of the initiatives that have been being taken in the past days and even weeks toward this, I wanted to have Harley Schlanger come on and do what he does and has done very often here. So Harley, good to see you. You just heard from Lynn, and I'm sure you will have thoughts both about what he had to say and also about the upcoming conference that we're about to have. So go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. And let me start by saying that seeing that clip from Lynn just reminds me that when one talks about forecasting, and especially Lynn's ability to forecast, that was extraordinary. His discussion of the Bush administration when it first came in, of starting wars for economic purposes, the idea of a Nietzschean state of mind, the will to power, which was exemplified by that administration, which literally gives you a roadmap to understand how economic policy of the Schachtian type, that is the Nazi policy, Schacht was Hitler's finance minister, and Lynn had been warning about that kind of policy, how that leads to war. From 2001 to the present, we're seeing an acceleration of that process that Lynn was warning about in that clip. Now, that's, in a sense, what Helga's discussing in the call for the convening a conference to set up a new Bretton Woods system. We're dealing with the collapse of the Anglo-American order. I don't think there's any argument against that. You have people who say, well, it's going to get better. You have Jerome Powell, who probably couldn't put 2 nickels together if he had to, talking about how I mean, actually, it's interesting. Powell contradicted Biden. Powell said, it's not Russia that caused the inflation. Then what did he say? It was the COVID crisis and supply chain disruptions, ignoring the reality that it was his own policy and the policy of the Federal Reserve of cheap, virtually zero interest rates to speculators, which is the cause for inflation. And we can talk about that some more. But what is underway is a collapse of the system. We have inflation that's continuing to accelerate, and it's accelerating because they have no cure for it. The idea that high interest rates will stop inflation, when the problem is the flow of funds to speculators will probably continue, because if it doesn't, you'll have chain reaction collapses. But if it does continue, you're going to have more inflation. And so either you have a bankruptcy reorganization, or you'll have a hyperinflationary collapse or a deflationary collapse. And you add to that the shortages of energy, which are related to the sanctions policy against Russia, shortages of food. This was going on long before the military operation in Ukraine. I'm sure people remember Dennis, Helga, Diane, Sarah, and myself talking about this a year ago, talking about David Beasley from the World Food Program warning of the coming famine that could affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Well, now it's here. And it's not here because of what's happening in Ukraine. It's here because of the green policy, because of the policies of the grain and food cartels, and the financial policies of the International Monetary Fund, suppressing the potential to develop of the poorer countries. So we have those shortages. We have an unpayable debt. Now, the question is, how do you deal with this? And I'm going to go through two different approaches very briefly. We'll discuss this more, I'm sure. Two different approaches on the economy and on strategic policy. Now, the real different approach is the one that we have, but for the moment, we're seeing a reflection of that coming from the BRICS nations, from Russia, from China, from some of the nations of the global south. So I want to compare what they're talking about in their summit that just took place with what's coming out of the European Union summit and the upcoming G7 summit. Now, what's the transatlantic response with the G7 and the European Union? Well, for one thing, they're talking about expanding the European Union to make it stronger by bringing in Moldova and Ukraine. This has nothing to do with economic policy. It has to do with geopolitics. It has to do with the war that NATO is running to destroy Russia. So first of all, that's not going to do anything to strengthen the economy or to strengthen the defense sector of those countries. Meanwhile, their policy is blame Putin. Blame Putin while you're trying to destroy Russia. Blame him for everything. Now, at the same time, prepare for the containment of China or war against China. It's not enough to have a war in Europe against Russia. Now we have to contain China, and if necessary, prepare to defend Taiwan by provoking China into some kind of an attack on Taiwan. At the same time, we have a doubling down of the monetarist neoliberal policy, the idea that it's a money question, that somehow you have to stop the flow of money or increase the or suppress the demand so that the prices go down. Well, the people who have this monetarist approach are the ones who created the crisis, the central bankers. Biden said he wants to keep the Federal Reserve in charge and stay out of the way. The Davos crew is saying give all power to the central banks. Take it away from parliaments. Give the spending policy power to central banks, not just the monetary policy. And what's their policy? Well, we see the use of interest rates, which is an austerity approach, the Shaktian austerity, the idea that somehow if you shut down production, the price of goods will drop. And at the same time, run a war economy. That is, you have sanctions, and at the same time you tell people, sorry about the austerity, but we need to do that to fight for freedom. The idiocy of a German politician who said in front of the Bundestag, we should be prepared to freeze for freedom. by shutting down the flow of Russian oil and gas into Europe. And people are going to freeze this winter, but it's not going to be for freedom. They're going to be freezing for their own self-induced slavery by not fighting the idiocy of the Greens, whether it's in the European Union or in US politics. So we're seeing a reaction to this. Social unrest, strikes in the United Kingdom, farmers marching in the Netherlands, anti-war protests, close to 100,000 people on the streets in Belgium, truckers, rail workers, farmers throughout the European Union. I'm sure we'll see something similar in the United States, although they're trying to direct it into so-called social issues, whether it's the question of fighting racism, fighting gender idiocy, or the ruling from the Supreme Court on abortion, to focus the anger on these social issues while people can't afford to put food on the table. So that's the problem that we have. Now, let me give you the alternative that's coming from the BRICS nations. And again, you'll hear a reflection in this of the work that we've been doing, fighting for a new Bretton Woods since the 1980s. We had a conference in right outside of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, I believe in 1984, as part of LaRouche's presidential campaign, to discuss at that time a revival of the Bretton Woods system. Not as it was when it ended in 1971, but as it was intended by President Roosevelt before the British got their hands on it. Now, here's what was discussed at the 14th Summit of the BRICS nations, which is taking place in Beijing. They issued something called the Beijing Declaration, and it states that their intent is to ensure that all developing and least developed countries, especially in Africa, have a say in global decision-making. And we're seeing that happen now as they're refusing many of these poorer nations that have had experience fighting the colonial powers of Europe for their independence, and then fighting the International Monetary Fund and the global banks to just have enough credit to feed their people. They're now having a say in global decision-making. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, opened the meeting by saying this is a critical juncture in the shaping of the future course of humanity. And we must act with a sense of responsibility to bring positive, stabilizing, and constructive strength to the world. He said the BRICS must ensure equity and justice, rejecting the Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation, the idea of unilateral sanctions and abusive sanctions, and small circles built around hegemonism. The way to fight it is to form one big family belonging to a community with a shared future for humanity. Now, he was followed by India's president or Prime Minister Modi, who said that we, the BRICS member countries, have had a very similar view of the governance of the global economy. And so our mutual cooperation can make a useful contribution to a post-COVID global recovery. And he said it's a matter of happiness that other nations want to join the BRICS and are being brought in as participants at this conference. He said, we do not just talk, we act. Now, this was then followed by South African President Ramaphosa, who said that the BRICS provides a valuable platform to address the key challenges of the Global South in partnership with like-minded emerging markets. And he said this is an important opportunity to form a common vision of a more inclusive, just, and stable international order. Now think about that for a second. While the European Union and NATO people are talking about a democratic world order, they're condemning some of these countries that are participating in the BRICS process, which is aimed at developing an economic system or an economic policy to lift people out of poverty in these countries the way the Chinese have done that with the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, finally, we have Putin's address, and I think it'd be very worthwhile for people to read his whole address if you can find it. But he said that the prestige and international influence of the BRICS is an objective process, since the 5 BRICS countries have immense political, economic, scientific, technical, and human potential. We have everything we need to work together and achieve results for ensuring global stability and security, sustained growth and prosperity, and better well-being for our people. He said that the crucial situation that has emerged in the world economy has emerged because of the ill-conceived and selfish actions of certain states, which by using financial mechanisms and shifting their own macroeconomic policy mistakes onto the rest of the world, are causing these crises. A week earlier at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, he specifically cited the monetary policy of the Western banks, the central banks, as the cause of inflation. And he made a joke, which was quite funny, about the one thing that's productive in the West is the printing presses, the money printing presses are very productive. Now, Putin went on to say something that has shaken the world considerably. He said the BRICS countries are working on reliable alternative payment mechanisms for international settlements. This means outside of the SWIFT system. And the discussion is that they will use their own currencies for doing this, and that they may produce a BRICS currency, which would be a basket of all the currencies of the BRIC countries to determine the value. But what he's really talking about in that is currencies that are based on physical goods production, that have something behind it, rather than a promise to pay off debt as you're issuing more debt to cover the old debt that can't be paid. Now, this is all occurring as we have this ongoing war. And I want to now look at the strategic situation for a minute, just to highlight again the contrast between these two outlooks. NATO will be meeting at the end of this month in Madrid. What's on the agenda? NATO expansion. Why is there a fight going on in Ukraine right now? NATO expansion to the borders of Russia. After a promise to Russian leaders in 1990, 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there would be no eastward expansion. Now they're talking about bringing in Finland and Sweden. There are technical problems for the moment, but they intend to do it. At the same time, they're talking about more arms to Ukraine and more military buildup in NATO countries, an increase in defense spending. In the United States, they just voted up another $30 billion above what Biden had asked for. It's now close to $800 billion in the U.S. defense budget. And there's also pressure from NATO countries, from the U.S., and especially from the United Kingdom, from the buffoon Boris Johnson, who went immediately to talk to Zelensky after Schultz, Draghi, and Macron had been there in case they were putting too much pressure on Zelensky to negotiate. Johnson went there and said, don't negotiate, we'll give you more arms, we'll give you more training, you've got to keep fighting. And that's what Stoltenberg and others were saying. Now, as they're pushing this policy of no diplomatic settlement and a buildup, the Ukrainian army is being decimated in the Donbass. There was a surrender yesterday. There's a surrounding of 2,000 more Ukrainian soldiers. A group of 150 to 200 neo-Nazi militiamen who are surrounded by the Russians. Either their decimation or surrender is going to happen soon. And nevertheless, you hear things such as German Chancellor Schultz saying Ukraine must win. Von der Leyen saying we must win against Russian aggression. Now, the dark side of this, or let's just take one other picture from the current fighting. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Macgregor has pointed out, in contrast to what Schultz and others are saying, that Ukraine has already lost. And Macgregor knows something about military combat. Scott Ritter, who also knows about combat, went even further. He said not only have they lost, but the loss by Ukraine will probably mean the end of NATO, which would be at least one good outcome from this war. But let me give you a picture from the dark side. And this is from especially the British. As we've always pointed out, when you see something like wars of these sorts, you've got to look at the British. mean, Boris Johnson just had an op-ed in the London Times where he spoke about our iron resolve never to countenance Putin's invasion. And Johnson said, Putin may not realize it, but his grand imperial design for the total reconquest of Ukraine has been derailed. And he identified the Battle of Kiev as the starting point of that derailment. Well, Johnson is a liar. There was no Battle of Kiev, and Putin never had a grand plan to conquer Ukraine. But he went on to say that we will preserve the viability of the Ukrainian state. Well, where were they to do that when the fascist coup took place in 2014? Now, while he's saying that, we have this from the new chief of the British Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders. In his first message to the troops, he said they must prepare to fight in Europe once again. And here's his Churchillian rhetoric. There is now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating the Russians in battle. That is, the British fighting and defeating the Russians in battle. We are the generation, he said, that must prepare the army to fight in Europe once again. Now, he's saying this as the British government is reducing the size of the army from 82,000 troops to 72,500 troops. Now, then you have Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, who is one of the people saying there shouldn't be negotiations, although he may have shifted that today. But he gave a talk 2 days ago where he said, we must prepare for the fact that it could take years to win the battle in Ukraine. We must not let up in supporting Ukraine, even if the costs are high, not only for military support, but also because of rising energy and food costs. Well, as I pointed out, there are demonstrations all over Europe against those policies. But here's the picture, what you might say from the really dark side, the military side, the military-industrial side. There are two, I'm going to just call your attention to two speeches, or one an article and one a speech, in the Royal United Services Institute publication by a retired American Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin. He wrote about how there's an imbalance between the Russian industrial economy and its war-fighting capability and that of the West. He says Russia has the industrial depth to sustain a prolonged war with sufficient ammunition. The West does not. And he said that must be remedied by rebuilding the industrial capacity for war production. Quote, a country must either have the manufacturing capacity to build massive quantities of ammunition or have other manufacturing industries that can be rapidly converted to ammunition production. Unfortunately, Vershinin writes, the West no longer seems to have either. And he then goes on to write, for the U.S. to act as the arsenal of democracy in defense of Ukraine, there must be a major look at the manner and the scale at which the U.S. organizes its industrial base. And he says this is especially crucial now because Russia has China working with it. And he says the West must assume that China will not allow Russia to be defeated, especially due to lack of ammunition. And so therefore we must have a move toward an industrial production for war. That's Vershinin's conclusion. The Royal United Services Institute is the preeminent British think tank going for defense and security purposes going back into the middle of the 19th century. Now then this was echoed by the chief of the defense staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin. And he said, look, the industrial capacity of Britain is a problem. Right now, the rate of expenditure of weapons in Ukraine and the inadequate industrial capacity to backfill orders has become a significant issue. And he said that this brings up the whole question of what must be done. He said, we must work to ramp up defense contractors to do more production. But he said, now we're talking in years because you cannot whistle up with modern weapons a quick production line. It could take 5 to 10 years before the UK could deploy a division with the capabilities to fight alongside US forces. So even as they're calling for fighting, the British troops fighting the war, they're admitting the Brits don't have the industrial capability, nor does the West, to sustain an economy, a healthy economy, and to fight a war of this sort, the old guns or butter problem. And so you have austerity. So you have the Great Reset. So you have the demand that we freeze for freedom of the neo-Nazis and the militias of Ukraine. Now, this war buildup reminded me of something when I went back and looked at some things from the pre-World War I period. When Edward VII, who was really the first universal fascist, he was what LaRouche was describing of a Nietzschean state of mind. When Edward VII was the king, he undertook a military buildup in the beginning of the 20th century based on the idea that the countries such as Germany, Russia, Japan, France, and the United States were advancing their military capabilities because of their industrial advances, the merger of science and technology with new industries, not for military conquest, but for the development of their economies. Now, for the British, the military strength had always been its navy. And so Edward VII undertook a crash mobilization to upgrade the British Navy. Now, this meant they had to break with the neoliberal policies and instead channel credit to production. And so, in a sense, under Edward VII, while the Brits were telling the rest of the world, you can't have national banks, you can't have tariffs, you have to have free trade, the Brits were using tariffs and directed credit to build up their war machine. And this came to a height in 1906, when Edward VII presided over the launching of the first modern warship, the HMS Dreadnought. Now, this was the original high-tech warship with huge guns, with 10-mile range, with cannonballs that were the size of small cars. With a 10-mile range, that was a very significant weapon. And electronic connection between the aiming of these cannon and the people who were down in the bowels of the ship. This was described as the most deadly fighting machine ever launched in the history of the world. Now, what was crucial about this was to prepare for the war, they dropped the policies that they were imposing on everyone else in the empire and trying to impose on the world, while adopting Hamiltonian policies to build a warship. And the result was that at a time when it took 10 years to build major battleships, they built this one in 1 year. And this was part of a war fever. People were marching in the streets, waving flags and cheering the king when the Dreadnought was launched. And so when the Parliament was debating whether they could afford to build more than one of these ships, the population was demanding 8, 10, 20. And you have this comment from Winston Churchill about the war fever. Churchill at the time was the Home Secretary. And he said, quote, "The Admiralty had demanded 6 ships. The economists offered 4. And we finally compromised on 8, unquote." That was the World War I buildup. And remember, what was the British interest in World War I? To break any potential for an alliance between Germany and Russia. And we see today as the German government is crawling on its knees before the British and NATO and the Americans, that they're trying to accomplish that, to break the connection that had been built up by industrialists in both nations based on mutual concerns and common interests. That's where we get to the alternative to the present financial and strategic architecture. That what a new Bretton Woods would represent is a move toward common cooperation, not just for development of sovereign nation states, but for the improvements in the conditions of living of all people on the planet by having the cooperation of those nation states. I urge you to read the call from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which includes specific points of what a new Bretton Woods would do and go out and organize with it, because that's the only alternative to war and fascist austerity that we have.
Okay, well, very good, Harley. We're getting questions in of various types. I think we'll go directly to those. And I'll just say, if you happen to have joined us late, this discussion is a preliminary discussion to an event that we're going to be having next Sunday at 1 p.m. It's a sort of an address which is on the new Bretton Woods and the necessity for a new Bretton Woods system, kind of declaration of independence from Malthusian genocide and austerity, done as a way of co-opting the questionable Declaration of Independence celebrations that sometimes happen in the United States and otherwise in the world. So there's several questions. Let me just go to the first one. This is from Chuck Jones. Isn't the concept for a new Bretton Woods at odds with the idea of a multipolar world order? To clarify, didn't the Bretton Woods system subordinate the world to the United States? That's the question. Isn't the concept for a new Bretton Woods at odds with the idea of a multipolar world order? And to clarify, didn't the Bretton Woods system subordinate the world to the United States?
Well, that's why I brought up in my presentation the new Bretton Woods would be based on the original plan that Franklin Roosevelt had, which was a plan for decolonization. It was, and instead of a multipolar, it was basically a world of mutual cooperation and development, because polar still implies, the potential for blocks. But as opposed to a unipolar world, the Bretton Woods system, as it was breaking down, the proposals were consistently those which benefited the London and Wall Street banks and the global corporate cartels, which took advantage of the poorer countries with the terms of trade that were adopted, the credit policies that were adopted, that when countries ran into problems paying the debt, they were hit with what were called structural adjustment plans, which essentially were austerity, that you shut down your spending on everything except debt payment. You prioritize debt payment. So the institutions of Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, became essentially agencies to help the debt collection by the global banks. That wasn't Roosevelt's intention. Roosevelt's intention was that the United States would use the arsenal of democracy to transform its economy into one that would increase development in the United States, at the same time aiding other nations to escape the poverty of the colonialism. There were these discussions, and if people can find it, there's an incredible video that we made some years ago called 1932, which has a section in it of a sort of reenactment of the Roosevelt-Churchill discussions, where Roosevelt said to Churchill, "Never again will Americans die to defend the British Empire. We will not defend British means." And he said specifically, "We're not going to allow you to recolonize the world." Well, that was Roosevelt's intention. But when he died, Truman fell under the grasp of people like the Atchisons, the Dulleses, the Prescott Bush, the cartel, the Harrimans, the people who were part of the global cartels who benefited from looting the third world. Now, this then was built into the World Trade Organization. So we've had an anti-development policy, especially since 1971, but even before that. Now, what we are advocating is that a series of meetings or conferences be convened which take up a discussion of the original FDR initiative and update it. But the idea is not to reestablish the power and control of US banks and London banks. These banks are going to have to be put through bankruptcy reorganization. That's the first step towards a new Bretton Woods. The whole financial and monetary policy of the Western world right now is to bail out the speculators who have used the cheap credit of the last, since the 2008 crash, to build up a bigger debt bubble than existed in 2008. That bubble is going to pop sooner or later. We want it done with an orderly reorganization, which essentially says we're going to start with Glass-Steagall, separate the commercial banks from the investment banks, keep the commercial banks alive for the purpose that they were set up for, which is businesses, savings accounts, checking accounts, bonds for development. But we're going to separate that from investment banks, which are there to speculate. Now, some people say, but speculation is necessary. Well, if people want to speculate, go ahead, but it's not going to be bailed out. There's no constitutional requirement that speculators be bailed out when their speculation goes bad. In fact, bankruptcy law comes from the constitutional principle of a sound financial system. So if you start with bankruptcy reorganization, we're not going to build a monetary system or a financial system that is oriented toward reestablishing that kind of control in the hands of private interests. That's where governments come in. And people say, well, governments are bad, governments are the problem. The governments we have been seized by the speculators, seized by the corporate cartels. The big money control the governments. Now, what happens if the people are educated to understand the American system, the way Lyndon LaRouche develops it, the way we were seeing done to get out of the Depression and then in the post-war period what Roosevelt intended? Suppose people understand this principle of the physical economy as opposed to money. So that's the way you prevent against establishing a new looting operation under the guise of a new Bretton Woods. Now, we already see, as I was reading you some of these quotes before, the Global South is not going to stand for a new looting system. What that means is they're on our side. And by our side, I don't mean the Bidens and the Mitch McConnells and the Jamie Dimons. They're on the side of the American people who are struggling to meet their monthly costs. We just don't know it. The American people don't know it because of the media control. So our task is to use this call from Helga Zepp-LaRouche to educate people to what physical economy is, what the American system is, and that because of the Constitution puts that power in our hands, not in the hands of private interests, but in the hands of people who will fight for the common good and the general welfare. That's what our Constitution was set up to do. We have to defend that Constitution and make sure it works.
Okay, we have another question. I'm going to just do first names and opinions for some of these questions for various reasons. So this one is from Munasha, and he asked this question: With this scale of NATO expansionism, is the continent of Africa safe? Chances are that some African countries might be drawn into a similar Ukraine-type situation.
Well, no, as long as you have NATO, no country's safe. The whole idea of Stoltenberg and Boris Johnson and others is global NATO, starting with the South Pacific. But the questioner is absolutely right about Africa. You know, we have U.S. troops, French troops, British operations all over the continent of Africa, supposedly as counter-terror operations or as stability operations. No, they're mostly there to protect governments that are there to collect the debt and pay the debt off. Now, that's the problem with Africa. But we're seeing now governments that are responsive to the needs for the development of sovereign nations, sovereign economies. And so those are the countries that will be targeted. For example, Nigeria. You know, the terrorism that's escalating in Nigeria is directly related to the fact that the government had committed itself to a policy of economic development, including support for the Lake Chad initiative that we've been involved with. The idea that you can replenish the waters of the Lake Chad region to ensure that instead of a shrinking lake, which is drying up economic cooperation and economic capability and creating a new refugee crisis, instead the Nigerian government came out fairly strongly for this Lake Chad Basin project. So, you see governments like that, or Ethiopia, which built this new dam. Some of the other countries that are working with China will be subject to terrorism, which will then be the basis for an expanded NATO. So again, this is where the question of economics and strategic policy go hand in hand. If we can carry out a policy for a new strategic and financial architecture, there will be no global NATO. In fact, there's already a potential to shut down NATO, which could come, ironically, from the French Parliament, where the largest group is in the so-called left and the right bloc. Many of them are opposed to French involvement in the NATO leadership. I think what Scott Ritter was saying is that with all the nonsensical pronouncements of the NATO leaders that were fighting for Ukraine's democracy and freedom against the Russian aggression, and we must win, well, reality is about to hit them like a ton of bricks. They're not going to win. And if they escalate, as we see with the attempt to cut off Kaliningrad, the war may spread to NATO in ways that they don't want. So I think the question is a legitimate one, but the solution is for African countries to continue to work together with those nations which will work for development, like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Russian commitment to provide help with nuclear energy development, the development of dams and continent-wide rail systems, improvement of the ports for a maritime Silk Road. So the potential is there to make sure this doesn't happen. But as we know, look, the question is very legitimate. Look what happened to Libya, where Gaddafi was trying to carry out major development programs, and he was targeted and destroyed by NATO and the United States. So that's why it's so urgent that we have this connection between strategic and economic policy.
Okay, we have a follow-up question from the same individual. He asks, can it be possible to invite the financial institutions and other influential financiers to the movement to engage them in the best investment portfolios other than arms industrial complexes, other than military industrial complexes? That's what he's really asking. So can it be possible to invite the financial institutions and other influential financiers to the movement to engage them in the best investment portfolios? You get the idea.
Well, I think it's something we should do. We should offer them an opportunity to stop looting. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase has become a billionaire, as have many of these guys, because of their speculative policies, their creation of new financial instruments, such as mortgage-backed securities and so on. I don't think they're going to give it up without a fight. And certainly we could invite bankers to join this, because banking itself is not an illegitimate profession. It's when you have bankers who are British neoliberals, who are trained by the City of London, by the London School of Economics, by Oxford, by Harvard University, by the American universities, where the teaching is that the goal of an economy is to make a lot of money. As LaRouche always said, money is stupid. Money needs to be directed. And this is where governments must play a role. And that's where you see the potential fight. Look, we went to various bankers with our last major initiative around Glass-Steagall. We went to bankers associations. Some of the smaller bankers associations endorsed a return to Glass-Steagall. And we had state legislatures that were introducing memorial bills calling for Glass-Steagall. Who intervened against it? The American Bankers Association, which represents the largest banks in the United States. Now, just one other thing that you should know. the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, is not a government institution. It's largely owned and controlled by private banks. And this has been exposed many times, but most recently, very powerfully, by some of the writings of the Wall Street on Parade, when they got the documents of the fourth quarter of 2019, when the Federal Reserve took over the repurchasing markets, that is the overnight loan lending markets that kept banks from going under. And the minutes from the Federal Reserve show that the New York Federal Reserve generated around $13 trillion during the fourth quarter of 2019 to bail out the banks for these overnight loans to stop their corporate customers from going bankrupt, to prevent a chain reaction collapse. Now, why did they do that? Well, because those corporations were owned largely, or a lot of the corporations owed money to those private banks. And why was the Federal Reserve pushing to bail out the private banks? Well, four of those banks, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and JP Morgan Chase, I think are the four, are the major stockholders of the New York Federal Reserve. So they were using the institution of the Federal Reserve to bail themselves out. So if you want to appeal to those guys, more power to you. But I think instead we need a regulatory process which says if you're going to go into banking, you're going to serve the common good, not your own pocketbook.
Relevant for people to think about is that people like Vladimir Putin are aware of the kind of thing that you just said, Harley, about the ability, the reckless ability of the banking establishment to access the Fed and then have the Fed print something like $13 trillion. And when we're hearing about the BRICS Plus conference, it becomes a big deal if Xi Jinping adds $1 billion to a previous development fund, the South-South Cooperation Fund. You just talked about the idea of $13,000 billion, which was basically generated in order to maintain solvency, so-called, merely fictitious solvency on the part of these companies. So it's just something for people to kind of think about as they're hearing some of these things.
Well, let me add a point on that, Dennis. If you go back to 2007, in July 2007, Lyndon LaRouche did a webcast, and he said, there's no way we're not going to have a banking crisis. And he referred to the policies of the Federal Reserve, agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that were working together with the private banks to use these new instruments called mortgage-backed securities to create huge volumes of credit that they knew in many cases would not be able to be repaid. That is, the value of homes were going up. People were using the money, the valuation of their homes to borrow more money, to buy a bigger home. And this was the bubble that was created after the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. So some of these things had been legalized during the deregulation bills of the 80s, under Reagan, and then later under Bush, and even under Clinton. There was deregulation bills that gave more power to banks. But the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 created the capability for the merger of the private investment banks to engage in mortgages and creating new financial instruments with the capital from the private banks, the commercial banks. And so you had this huge pool of money that was created that went into these phony instruments. And so you had, at a certain point, too many people couldn't pay the mortgages, but not only that, there was no one to loan the money to the banks to roll it over. And so LaRouche warned in July 2007 this is going to crash. And as this thing was underway, he came up with a plan called the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, which would have protected homeowners and commercial banks, but would have started with Glass-Steagall and basically was a policy for no bailout. There was a huge fight over this during the 2008 presidential campaign. People may remember that Bush, Hank Paulson, and others said, we have no choice but to do a bailout, the so-called TARP plan. Now, interestingly, there were some people, not John McCain himself, but some people who were supporters of McCain's candidacy, who told McCain he should not support the legislation that would set up the government, the congressional bill for TARP, that is the bailout bill. And McCain was called into Washington, along with Obama, to meet with Paulson and the others to discuss what to do. And essentially, Obama said, I'm supporting the bailout, and John, if you don't, when the banks crash, it'll be on you. And McCain, through his staff, had actually asked us to provide something on what LaRouche was proposing. And I got a note back saying, well, this is a pretty good proposal, but John's not going to go with it. And instead, McCain got arm twisted, or who knows what they did with him, but he ended up agreeing with Obama to support the bailout. That's how the bailout got pushed through the Congress in 2008 with virtually no opposition, because what they were told is that if we don't do this bailout, the whole banking system will collapse. Now, we're at that point again today on a much larger volume of debt, of all categories of debt, the so-called everything bubble. And so unless you have an emergency reorganization, you're going to have the biggest bubble in world history popping at great expense of human life on the planet.
This might be the relevant next question. This is from Kynan, and he asks this. Yesterday was the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Walter Rathenau, the German foreign minister who had designed the Rapallo Treaty to save the German economy through economic cooperation with the then newly formed Soviet Union. Had his plan actually been implemented, the Second World War would have never occurred, and Germany would have broken with the geopolitical order of the British by forming a partnership with the Soviet Union. Can you talk more about the importance of this individual and why his example should or should not be followed today to prevent another war and a global economic catastrophe?
Well, this is an important point, and I've been writing a little bit about this and talking about it on my daily update. It was in April of 1922 when a conference was held to discuss how to keep the reparations payments going, because there was a fear that Germany might default. After Versailles, the decision was made by largely the British, with the backing of the pathetic Woodrow Wilson, the globalist Woodrow Wilson, that Germany should be punished and should have to pay reparations. Well, the German economy had been exhausted by the war, as had all the economies of Europe. And so to put an additional burden on them was creating chaos in the streets of Germany and an unstable government, especially after the overthrow of the Kaiser, the abdication of the Kaiser in 1918. So what happened was that you had this individual, Rathenau, who's quite an extraordinary individual. He was a scientist. His father was the founder of AEG, which is the equivalent at the time of General Electric in the United States. He was, in some ways, a collaborator of Thomas Edison. His father was. Walter Rathenau was a classical musician. He used to play music with people such as Albert Einstein. And during World War I, he was brought in to organize the war effort for Germany, to make sure that industry was producing enough to keep the war going while the population was fed at home. And a monumental task. And by the way, for people who don't know, Germany was not the villain in World War I. It was the British. I mentioned Edward VII earlier. It was the British who broke the potential for an alliance between France, Germany, and Russia for the purposes of organizing a war using one of the hotspots, that is the Balkans, and the mobilization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and so on, as the trigger point to get a war. Now, after the war, Rathenau was brought in as foreign minister, and he realized Germany could not pay this debt. So at this meeting that was taking place in Italy, he had a side meeting with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Georgy Chicherin. And what they talked about was, could we take the industrial potential of Germany and the potential of investment from Germany into Russia to help industrialize Russia in return for Russian raw materials, labor, and a market? And this was the basis of what was called the Rapallo Treaty, which was signed, I think it was April 16th or so in 1922, in the town of Rapallo, Italy. Now, immediately, the British went berserk because this was their worst fear after defeating Germany in the war, largely because of the US intervention, the idea that Germany would now work with the Russians. Now, at that time, the Soviet Union was also being cut off from credit, was being targeted with economic warfare. And Lenin adopted something called the New Economic Plan, which was based on essentially electrifying Russia, building an energy industry, using the scientific capabilities to upgrade the country, and doing it by opening itself to foreign investment. But the British and others said, no foreign investment. So this Rapallo Treaty offered something both what you might call win-win for Germany and Russia. But it went against the British design of punishing Germany with reparations. And so on June 24th, 1922, 100 years ago yesterday, as he was driving to work in Berlin, Rathenau was shot and killed by what was called right-wing assassins, who were part of the group that claimed that Rathenau's agreement with the Soviet Union was selling out Germany to the Bolsheviks, to the Jewish bankers, and Rathenau, who was Jewish, was a special target for them, and they killed him. And there was no one in the German government who stepped forward after that, probably paralyzed by fear, to address the continuation of Rapallo, and so it never was fulfilled. Shortly after that, Germany adopted a policy of printing money to both pay the debt and to try and keep an economy going. And you had the Weimar hyperinflation, which then led to social chaos basically for the next 10 years, in which you had growth of the extremes, the so-called left-wing communists, the right-wing Nazis. In fact, they were both integrated. You had people who in the morning would march with the Nazis and in the afternoon with the communists. They were against the system. And this was used by the bankers as an excuse to bring in Hitler, and then to use the Reichstag fire to have the Notverordnung, the emergency decree, which became the basis of the Hitler dictatorship. So the suspicion is that these so-called right-wing terrorists were in some way or another directed from the outside. Not that they needed an excuse to kill Rathenau, but that it served a purpose. A similar thing happened in 1989 when Alfred Herrhausen was a leading banker in Germany and was orienting toward not a shock therapy policy toward the Soviet Union, but a German investment policy in Russia. And Herrhausen, who was preparing some initiatives to have his bank invest in Russia and organize others to do so, he was murdered in cold blood, again by terrorists of unknown origin. And so what was the result of that? The only alternative on the books was shock therapy. There was one other alternative, which was that of the LaRouches for the industrial triangle economic development of Russia, which didn't happen because Lyndon LaRouche was in prison. And people who were supporters of that idea saw the assassination of Herrhausen and also Rohweder, who was the head of the Treuhand, the agency that was supposed to figure out how to reindustrialize East Germany. He was also murdered. So murdering officials who can think, or jailing them and slandering them, as they did with Lyndon LaRouche, is the classical method used by the Nietzschean state of mind to suppress the opposition. And war works very favorably toward doing that. And that's also a reason behind this whole situation in Ukraine.
Here's our next question, and it says this. George Bush, this goes back to May of this year, May 18th. He was denouncing Russian President Vladimir Putin in the course of a speech in Texas. Said this: the result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean of Ukraine. Bush then added, Iraq too. The London Guardian immediately tried to cover this up in other publications and so on, but it was obvious that Bush had said something that, as one commentator put it, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. In an instant, the gaffe took me back 17 years in time. So the question is this what is meant by the beast or the Nietzschean mentality of Bush? And if so, how do you explain how that kind of a mentality can infect a population at large?
Well, it's not a hard argument to say Bush is not one of the brightest bulbs in the chandelier. But look who put him in office. Bush was specifically, I'm talking now about Junior. Bush Senior is a different case. He basically came out of this whole Wall Street crew of the Bushes, the Harrimans, and others. His Bush Senior's father, Prescott Bush, was a Connecticut senator who was part of the Union Bank Corporation of the Harriman family. So you had Bush Senior, who, by the way, was also not very bright, but knew who he was serving. Bush Jr. Was what he appears to be, a cynical, kind of clownish type character, a go-along to get along guy, but underneath a very nasty character. And we saw that especially with George Sr., who on several occasions made comments about wanting to make sure that he got rid of LaRouche. Bush Jr. personally ordered me to have my press credentials for the state legislature in Texas when he was governor taken away from me. But more importantly, who was running his government? He was vetted by George P. Schultz, who goes back to the same Harriman-Bush networks on 120 Broadway in New York City that were part of the cartel arrangement that put Hitler in power. Schultz had convened a session in his home outside of Stanford University, Palo Alto, California, where he brought in what they called the Vulcans, people like Condi Rice, people like Wolfowitz and others. And they brought Bush there, Bush Jr., when he was governor of Texas. And they said, this is the man we want for president. And they immediately surrounded him by people like Wolfowitz, the Kagans, Cheney, and so on. We wrote a book about this called The Children of Satan. And what was the key influence on this, at least through the Cheneys, Rumsfeld, and others? It was Leo Strauss, who you heard LaRouche mention in the clip we saw before. This idea of a Nietzschean will to power, that might makes right. And that was the view of Bush. Now, the fact that he made that slip of the tongue, so-called, when he said, that this shows what one man can do, like ordering the destruction of Iraq, I mean Ukraine. There may be a part of him that feels some guilt about that. I doubt it. But who probably recognizes that most of the world sees him in that way. Now, in the United States, they're trying to portray him as part of the club. He's friendly with Obama now. He's friendly with Clinton. What you see is the unipolar order in the two parties, with the Bushes, the Obamas, the Clintons, and so on. And I think the idea that Bush is just a nice guy who's becoming a painter, is a cover story for the fact that he was at least a willing participant in the genocide carried out against Iraq based on what he knew was false intelligence. And that, I think, characterizes him. And any slip of the tongue he might make to confirm that, well, that's just useful.
Okay, there's a question from Bob, who's in the chat, going back and forth with some people. He says this: voting isn't working. Educating the mass voter base doesn't seem to work either. So what is next?
Well, look, you have, unless you're advocating an armed revolution and civil war, the question is, how do you win a fight like this? Now, I think the pessimism that's reflected in that question is the problem we have to address. And you address it by looking at the fact that most of the world hungers for economic development, including the American people. America was, for a time, the nation unchallenged in its ability to bring online new technologies. And I'm not talking about the computer revolution. I'm talking about going back to what developed around Abraham Lincoln and the rail revolution, the development of the steel industry, the development of the combustion engine, and so on, the ability to refine petroleum products. There's so much that's characteristic of an optimistic process that when you make credit available to entrepreneurs, investors, research and development, and developing the labor force, you can create an economic miracle. Now, that optimism has been drained away since the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and the introduction of the rock, sex, drug counterculture, which essentially said, get stoned and ignore reality. You can't change it. And as people see how bad our government has become, how corrupt it is, the cabal that's running it, instead of taking that as the impetus to study who's doing this, why, how, what are their weaknesses, and how can we defeat them? Instead, people are saying they're too powerful, we have to resort to something else, or else just give up, or become preppers and live off the land, which, in this kind of coming cataclysm doesn't work. So what are your alternatives? Suicide by civil war, or an educational process where you go out and appeal to the best instincts of your neighbors, your coworkers, give them an idea of what the potential is if we break the power of this parasitical looting operation centered in Wall Street and London. And then, importantly, and this is where I think the biggest battle is, who are our allies in this? The Russians and the Chinese. There's been so much crap put out, propaganda, psychological warfare, to use a more correct term, about China and Russia. And we've exposed the lies. The whole Xinjiang province attack on the Uyghurs, the slave labor, the brainwashing, the murder. It's not true. It is provably false. It's a narrative as false as the idea that Putin helped Trump get elected in 2016. So people who have come to realize that the Putin-Trump story was a lie, a fabrication, nevertheless are willing to swallow the stories about China as a communist dictatorship that's out to destroy the United States. Some of them still believe that Putin is a dictator who's threatening American interests. This is where we have an educational responsibility. These things are provably false. Now, if people don't want to believe them, then they're losing the best potential allies we have against the City of London. Why do you think there's such a psychological warfare campaign against Putin and against Xi Jinping? Because they don't go along with the principles behind programs such as the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. Now, I know the Chinese talk about environmentalism. They're talking about something different, what we used to talk about with the idea of clean air, clean water. And the Chinese realize that the way you address these problems is you move to higher temperature burning processes in your industrial production. Harnessing laser technology, plasma technology, development of nuclear fusion, space exploration. In other words, you go to higher scientific orders of energy flux density to improve the environment. What's the Western policy? Go back to wood burning, go back to solar, shut down fossil fuel, nuclear power, coal burning processes in a program that will depopulate the earth. So who are the allies of those who wish to defeat the bankers and the globalists, the Davos crowd? The people who are under attack by them, including, if you haven't noticed it, look at the attacks on India now. Why is India under attack? Because they won't go along with the sanctions against Russia, because they're looking at the possibility, as Modi said, of using the discussions of the BRICS to come up with an alternative transfer system for finances that goes outside of the collapsing petrodollar system. So, I'm not impressed by people who say voting didn't work, this didn't work, we're losing everything. No, we've got the potential to move the population, but we have to educate them. We have to inspire them with higher ideas than just vengeance against corrupt bankers, but actually thinking about what it means to make the United States again a city on a hill, a beacon of liberty and hope for the rest of the world, instead of an oppressor that's sponsoring policies of depopulation and Malthusian genocide. So it's really up to us. And don't look for a simple answer on this. We can win over the majority, or at least a significant minority of the population. Remember, the American Revolution was not made by a majority, but by a minority, but was educated over 30 to 40 years by Benjamin Franklin's works, by the work of a small group of founding fathers who conducted scientific and philosophical debate. That's what we need, but we don't have 30 years. But LaRouche did a lot of this work for us. It's up to us to take these ideas, like the idea of a new Bretton Woods, and show people how this is the way to improve not only your life, but the life of your children and grandchildren.
Okay, this next question is from Emmanuel. He asked some basic questions, which I think are rather useful that somebody decided to actually ask them. Where was slavery in the United States during the Declaration of U.S. Independence? When was slavery stopped? And when was the Declaration of Independence? That Declaration of Independence is for whom? So again, where was it? When was slavery stopped? Which is, of course, a different question. When was the Declaration of Independence? And then that Declaration of Independence is for whom?
Well, this is a very complicated question, but it's a useful one. And Dennis, you may want to say something about it. But the Declaration of Independence was meant as a universal declaration, except for the fact that there were whole sections of the United States that had slavery, that allowed slavery, and that the ability to break from Britain would have been undermined had there been a commitment from the beginning to free the slaves. Now, there were people like Hamilton who said we should take that chance. There were members of the Founding Fathers who thought that this was such an important issue that it would be worth risking the unity of the colonies over it. But in the end, they kicked it down the road. And they had provisions for when to stop slave trading and so on, but it never got done because the biggest problem was that when we broke with the British, we didn't fully break with the British system, which was still in the colonies in the form of the Boston Brahmin, the traders from Boston, the New York City bankers, such as Aaron Burr, who killed Hamilton, and the Southern planters. And it wasn't until we had a civil war that this issue came to a head with the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln in 1863. Now, that didn't solve the problem either. This has been an ongoing battle in the United States over the idea, which, ultimately boils down to the acceptance of a portion of the population of the idea of superiority of one race over the other, as opposed to recognizing there is one race, it's the human race. So this is a fight that still has to be fought and won. Now, where is it most powerful right now? It's not so much in the United States as it is the treatment of African nations. The idea that starvation of people in East Africa doesn't really matter so much because they're not like us. The idea that we don't break the control over Afghanistan to make sure there's food for the Afghan children, but we do spend $60 to $70 billion to arm neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I don't know any other way to say this, but that's a continuation of an institutional racist policy. They don't look like us. They're not like us. So what does it matter if Afghan babies die? What does it matter if children in East Africa starve? That's the fight we're still fighting, and that's why Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in drafting the Schiller Institute founding document, the Declaration of the Rights for Humanity, I can't remember the exact title, Dennis knows it, but she took the Declaration of Independence and added a few things to extend it to the whole of the human race. That's the basis of the founding document of the Schiller Institute. And that's a fight that we still have to fight. Look, a lot of the anti-China stuff is a remnant of the racism against the Chinese, against Asian people. So we're still in the, as we often say, the infancy of man, where we're still trying to work our way through these things. Now, the best way to do that is through cooperation and common commitment to economic development. But I think the attempt to say that the Declaration of Independence was racist, the Constitution was racist, the Founding Fathers were all slave owners and racist, that's a fake rewriting of history to play into an agenda of what is, at this point, again, the attempt to use identity politics to prevent this country, the United States, from developing a national mission to carry through the vision of the Founding Fathers as realized through Roosevelt's attempt with the Four Freedoms and the United Nations and the New Bretton, or the original Bretton Woods. And that's the fight we still have to win.
Yeah, I think what will happen, Harley, I think we've had a few more questions, and then maybe in the conclusion, I can say something about that matter, because as you already indicated, it's both complex. I think the other thing that this individual in particular needed to know was that the Declaration of U.S. Independence was July 4th, 1776, as the result of the deliberations at a several days conference that occurred upon the occasion of Ben Franklin returning from England, where he was trying to negotiate independence from, not even independence from England. They were trying to actually negotiate some sort of actual understanding so that they didn't have to go to the level of independence. It had Tom Paine write Common Sense, a pamphlet that had circulated very widely in the colonies before that, in preparation for the option that they would have to declare independence. But that was not originally the orientation that they were taking. They were just ready to do it if they needed to do it. And what happened was, after a several-day conference in Philadelphia, upon Franklin's return, that's what they decided to do. When those people signed that document, they were all committing treason, and they were all subject to the penalty of death. It's something that's just relevant to know about what it meant and what this document meant. In the deliberations, there are many things that can be said about it. Particularly South Carolina had already said that it would not sign the Declaration if the question of slavery and the eradication of slavery were made part of the document. And there was a decision made that people would go ahead with it. One of them in and they would have to deal with this question later. John Adams in particular was opposed to that decision. Many people were opposed to the decision, but the whole point was that this was a deliberative process. It's important because that's exactly what we're talking about having to do now. The circumstance that you're looking at in the United States today, and the circumstance that we're looking at in terms of leadership today, is one that requires that we take actions which are a good deal different than the ones that people are thinking. They are not in the electoral arena. They're also in the electoral arena, but they're not limited to the electoral arena. So just from the standpoint, I think, of continuing to answer people's questions, we'll say more about that in the conclusion. But I'd like to give you, really, let's say I'm gonna do something a little bit different and give you 2 questions, and then there's a together. One is from MJ, who says, "Heyo, I am in some leftist circles, and a lot have a fairly defeatist attitude, especially with electoral politics. How do we deal with that?" The second is from Dave, who just says the whole system is corrupt. So what's the actual solution? I think we should just take those 2 together.
Well, I wouldn't argue with the second point that the system is corrupt. It's become corrupt. But the principles of the American system have been violated by the corrupt individuals. So it's not that the principles on which the American system is based, namely the Hamiltonian credit system, the idea that the general welfare is should be the concern of government, and that the way you can do that is through harnessing private interests to work for the general good, which is what Hamilton had in mind. That Hamilton was not opposed to bankers making money, but he said they should make money through doing things that are good for the country, like investing in infrastructure, road building, canals, bridges, ports, the Society for Useful Manufactures, so that the United States could have a system with patents and things of that sort to develop new industries that could employ people and increase production. So it's not the American system of physical economy that's corrupt. It's the takeover of that system by corrupt swindlers, which has occurred throughout our history. There's been fights over this. You had, especially in the 20th century, the development of the corporate trusts, and you had the phony trust buster Teddy Roosevelt. But actually, all that did is allow for a different kind of monopoly taking over. But you actually had, with Franklin Roosevelt, a break with that with the Glass-Steagall, which went after the bankers who tried to use the control over integrated systems. For example, the utility companies were wholly owned subsidiaries of banks, which meant that if you wanted electricity in the rural areas, you had to give some kind of special profit motive to the private bankers. Roosevelt attacked that. The various programs for economic development, the TVA, the CCC, the WPA, all of these things were government providing credit to do useful things, and people supported it. People say, oh, Roosevelt was so bad. Well, how did he get elected 4 times? He was running against Wall Street figures, and he made that his campaign. So, I think the point is that our system can work. But what we've seen now is, especially since, as I said earlier, the assassination of John Kennedy, a corruption of that system and the increased power in the hands of the few, the billionaires. Whether you talk about the Davos Group, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, these are essentially self-interested, very wealthy people who pretend they care about the population and care about the well-being of others, but who actually, in reality, are only concerned with increasing their own power. Now, the first question, what do you do with people who are defeatist? Well, I think we should take a look at what's happening now in Ukraine as an example. because here you had a situation where Putin had tried, going back to the time he came into office, 1999, 2000, to work with the West, to establish partnership with Western leaders. And then over Ukraine, tried to work out with them why it is that Ukraine is a concern to Russia, and especially after the coup, which was run by the same corrupt networks, the neoconservatives working with the neoliberals like George Soros to carry out a coup there. What did Putin do? He kept at it. And he kept at it in two ways. He developed the scientific capability of Russian industry, which had a definite offshoot in its military capabilities. But at the same time, he was working to establish relations with other governments, including especially with China, for commitment to the mutual development of both countries. He would have liked to do that with Ukraine. He was asking for security guarantees, which he never got. Now, when this special military operation was launched, everything was aimed at Putin, including vast sums of money to arm the Ukrainians, the very Ukrainians Putin was saying had to be taken out of the military, the neo-Nazis. Now, for those who think you can't succeed in this, I think ultimately the Russian special military operations will succeed unless the lunatics in the West escalate to the point that we end up in a nuclear war. Now, why am I saying that? Well, Putin had a vision, had an idea, and he worked with people, including people in the economic realm, the scientific realm, to pull together policies that could develop the country. Now, we saw something, and this will be somewhat controversial, but in 2016, there was a movement that put in someone who was an outsider, Donald Trump. Outsider in a certain way. He wasn't a pure outsider because he had connections to all these networks. But what he was talking about in his campaign, Glass-Steagall, friends with Russia, the unleashing of American industrial capability, this ignited a spark, which was helped, of course, by the fact that he was running against someone who was very unlikable, Hillary Clinton. And he got elected. We had an opportunity then. And part of the problem is that we saw the use of the Russiagate fabricated charges against him to essentially stop him from doing what he should have done to clean up the swamp. He ended up bringing in people like John Bolton, who's part of the Bush swamp, Steve Mnuchin, who was one of the profiteers from the mortgage-backed security situation, General Mattis, who was still committed to the idea of fighting these wars. So Trump was not able to end the wars, he was not able to drain the swamp, and he didn't defeat Wall Street. But the potential was there. That's what got him elected. Now, part of the problem is if you look at the way the U.S. is polarized, you have these social issues. You have the left versus the right, liberal versus conservative, left versus neocons. But if you look in the Congress, what you find is the so-called left, like the squad of AOC or Bernie Sanders, they're supporting this damn NATO buildup against Russia. So they're phony. The problem isn't that the people are bad, it's that the political leaders are corrupt. That has to be exposed. And at the same time, we need to develop a new organic leadership in the country. Hopefully, some of it will come from younger people who don't buy into these narratives, but that requires a lot of education. The same way LaRouche took on the rock, sex, drug counterculture in the 60s to recruit people like Dennis and me, who otherwise, where were we going? We were part of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement was being directed in a very destructive way toward environmentalism, toward drug legalization. So many of these same fights are still there. I think if we make the effort and don't get intimidated by the lack of responsiveness from the media. The media is part of the enemy. So we're creating our own institutions. We need to have things like this video or the webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche become viral. Younger people who believe in these ideas have to use their skills in social media to make sure that millions of people hear these discussions of the Manhattan Project, that millions of people tune into my daily update, that millions of people watch Helga's weekly webcast, so that these ideas can be debated. We're not saying you have to agree with us on everything, but what you should agree with is that we need an honest, open debate outside of the controlled axioms of the media and the establishment, and especially outside of the doom and pessimism that's been induced by those people who claim to be against this system, but then say that you can't beat it.
Yeah, as I think what we can do, Harley, as we come to the end here, we have several other questions. We're not going to take all of them, but I'll also take a moment now just to point out to people that you can join the LaRouche organization. You can also join the Schiller Institute. These are different organizations. And the point of the thing, however, is to get active and be deployed. Let's just take this last thing you brought up. Next week will be the 4th of July. And you can go on YouTube and see very lengthy takedowns, gotcha sort of takedowns of people in the United States of what they don't know about this date and what they don't know about the participants in the war, what the role of the British was, or any of the other things. What you don't see on the internet is how that problem is to be solved and what people are doing to solve it. So we want to start solving that problem. And the reason we want to solve it is because we recognize that time is of the essence as to what's right now occurring. The system and the systematic blowout of the type that we saw in 2008 is about to occur again in that kind of lurid technicolor fashion, unless something can be done to not save the system, because the system cannot be saved. Therefore, the people that are worried about the issue of the system don't have to worry because it cannot be saved. But the other problem is, will that breakdown provoke thermonuclear war? That's the problem that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and others have to also consider, and the American people have to consider as well. So just to say, first of all, in joining the LaRouche organization, you do receive a copy of the Executive Intelligence Review magazine, as well as our daily alert. What's relevant there is that means that people can be updated not only on a regular basis, but importantly with the IR, the archive that we have. It's a magazine that was published every week, with the exception of 2 weeks out of the year from 1974 until now. And we did it, our organization has done that. It's 48 years. And in addition to the documentary coverage from the IR, there are also, importantly, the articles written by Lyndon LaRouche, strategic studies, you can call them, which have this quality of forecasting when you then put them up 20 years after an event, and you see him describe the nature of a regime in which certain things then occur. And therefore, this question of so-called conspiracy takes on a completely different role, which is the issue of the arc of current history. For example, at one point, Lyndon LaRouche used to talk about that Operation Barbarossa, which was launched against the Soviet Union by the Nazi forces of Adolf Hitler in June. It was June 22nd, I believe, in 1941. That Operation Barbarossa was not something that happened because it was provoked by something that Poland did or anybody else did. It happened because of Hitler having written Mein Kampf. So by the 1920s, mid-1920s, you knew that what happened in Operation Barbarossa was going to happen. So that this idea of looking at agency and looking at the idea of forecasting by having a method to do that is very important. These things are in EIR. These things are available with a TLO membership. There'll be a link in the chat that will be put there for people. Maybe we'll have also some links here for joining that or joining the Schiller Institute. So I want to now just go back to give you, Harley, some really there'll be questions from two individuals, and then we'll wrap up. So two questions. Can sanctioning countries be the best alternative? In most instances, the victims are the ordinary civilians. What can be done not to inflict hardship on innocent people? That's one question. The second question from the same individual says, I am compassionate about Julian Assange's democratic stand to let the world know the truth. Why is the truth being attacked ferociously and criminally suppressed using the term democracy to do it? So those are the two questions from the same individual.
Well, on sanctions, I think sanctions are a war crime. The idea that one country is powerful enough to impose its will on other countries, which is what the rules-based order is not acceptable. It should not be acceptable in human society. And yet what we see is people like Blinken and Sullivan and Bojo and others who basically say, we're the democracies, we're the good guys, and you're the bad guys, you're the autocrats, so whatever we want to do, we can do, because we're powerful enough to do it. That's what NATO is, an enforcement arm, not a very good one. I mean, basically without the United States, NATO is nothing, but an enforcement arm of a global dictatorship, increasingly a global financial dictatorship, which seeks to punish nations which won't accept the terms of their enslavement. And so when you have a nation that wishes to function as a sovereign nation, and look, sometimes sovereign nations make mistakes. They do things that aren't so good. If they do something that steps over the line, for example, launch a war, as in for example, with Iraq. What did Iraq do in 2001 that led to the invasion and the destruction of the country and the murder of its leader? And it did nothing. It was a false narrative that was put up as the basis for crushing them. Same thing with Libya. Same thing with the situation in Yemen. So the sanction policy is, in a sense, an assertion of physical power to enforce rules that are arbitrary and should never be allowed. That's why you should stick to the UN Security Council and the United Nations. These are flawed institutions, but they do at least and sometimes in the past, allowed for discussion. Now, of course, the US is trying to shut down discussion completely by silencing the Russians. So sanctions should never be tolerated. And people say, well, it's an alternative to war. Well, the sanctions against Iraq are acknowledged by US leaders who implemented them, including Madeleine Albright, to have killed 500,000 Iraqi children by withholding food and medicine to them. And Albright said that was justified. How can a leader of a country justify the murder of 500,000 children because you don't like what the president of that country is doing? So I would argue that sanctions are economic warfare and should not be, have no place in the modern world. Instead, you should have something called diplomacy. Now, the first part of that was, what was the second part of the question, Dennis? I didn't write it down.
Julian Assange. Julian Assange.
Oh, yeah, Julian Assange. Well, the people who proclaim this rules-based order are the ones who are sentencing Julian Assange to death. What do they not like about Assange? Well, Assange didn't break the law. He didn't hack the Defense Department documents. He published them. Under the US Constitution, we have freedom of the press. First of all, Assange isn't even an American, though, so why do we have jurisdiction over him? But the question is, why is he being punished for getting out the truth? And the truth is the documents of the Defense Department and the Pentagon, which showed that the United States was committing war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's generally well known. So what they're doing is using the case of Assange to intimidate any journalist, any citizen who wishes to know the truth by saying, if you do that, we have power over you. That's what the Patriot Act was about. That's what this disinformation council that was being set up is about. It's about protecting the false narratives and punishing those who challenge them. Now, the Assange case, it's, in my thinking, deplorable that Americans who talk about freedom of the press, who are all worked up about Elon Musk and Twitter and the importance of having free and open social media, why aren't those people focused on freeing Julian Assange? Why are people tolerating the judicial murder of him? And it's not a question of whether you like him or like what he said. He did nothing that actually what he did, he should be honored for, making sure the truth got out, as opposed to left to rot in a dungeon in London and pretty soon in a dungeon in the United States. So I would urge people who are talking about Elon Musk and Twitter and the censorship in the United States, why don't we make it a point to mobilize a movement to free Assange, which is not just about Assange, but is about the real principle of a free process of deliberation to liberate us from these narratives of lies that are coming from the so-called rules-based order.
Okay, and the final question for you is going to be from Jose, and it is this: that in the clip we showed of Lynn, video clip, he said, when man uses his brain and then his mind, that is, he said, when a man uses his brain, then use the term his mind. What was Lynn's take on the difference between the two?
You know, Dennis, I think he talked about that on several occasions, that the brain is a collection of nerves and a central organizing center, but that the mind represents the actual character of the person, how you take what you have absorbed and through your human character are able to use that to develop new capabilities. And I think this goes back to the whole question of Plato and Socrates, the development of the moral philosopher king, that it's not just a question of knowing things, of having synapses that work, that enable you to accumulate a lot of facts or information, but how, as a human individual, you're able to organize that in such a way as to affect the world. And in that sense, it's how the mind is a representation of this dimension that Vernadsky called the noosphere, as opposed to just a physical process. So that's the best I can do, Jose, and maybe we can talk about it more later.
Okay, well, Harley, I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to thank everybody that had questions. I want to thank everybody that's also watching. And I think that what we might best do in terms of implementation on this is that we put everybody to work. Now, there are a lot of things that you can help us do. Harley already referenced that getting out programs like the one we just did, getting them out on the internet is very important. Also, from our conference of this past weekend, there are many excerpts from that conference that people can circulate. And if you find that there are particular excerpts that are more useful to you than others, that would be very important that we do. For example, the Colonel Richard Black discussion of why he believes that Ukraine has lost the war and what he believes about why that war, in any case, was unjustified. In terms of what and as well as his view of what should be done now, that's available for people, and you should help us circulate that to military persons. We need that people decide to sign the petition that we have associated with this new Bretton Woods system. Some people think they have to study the petition, and that's not a bad thing. Some people recognize what the petition says right off, and they're signing it. But I think what we can have people do is just help us. And again, remember, you can join the LaRouche organization. Again, that will be up in the chat room for those of you who are following us there. We urge that you do that. We urge that you also join the Schiller Institute. So, but in closing, we're going to say a few things just to set up next week. Now, there will be a presentation that will be made next Saturday, as we always have done, including on 4th of July weekends. But that's not the main event that we're involved in next week. What we want to direct everybody's attention to is what we're going to do on Sunday at 1 p.m. And this is an attempt to assemble people from all over the country, and there will be people looking in from all over the world, for an address in which what we want to do is put forward our alternative So in other words, it was several things have been said today. What do we do about the corruption? What do we do about the fact that the system is rotten? How do we get people to organize, particularly since it doesn't seem that people are responding? Well, what we have to do is to demonstrate what we should do. And that's what we intend to do next Sunday. We want you to be part of that demonstration. And so the concept behind the presentation is to promote and to present the concept, the principle of how you will create a new world economic order. This is not a communist idea. It's something that comes right out of what the founding fathers did. The problem is that there's very little understanding about what they did. Not merely because people think that the thing was something that happened as a result of taxation questions that had erupted in Boston between 1763 and 1776, but that people don't want to even have never been told that the American Revolution was the result of a very well organized conspiracy, which was organized by Benjamin Franklin and many others. Conspiracy is not a bad thing. What do you think you have to do if you're living underneath the colonial dictates of the most powerful military power in the world? Of course, you've got to organize from the standpoint of like a resistance to do that. And that was done. But just in terms of provoking people to think about some of these matters, what we'd like to do is to end by referring to the painting Washington Crossing the Delaware, sometimes also called Washington's Crossing, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The scale of this painting immediately shocks everybody when they see it because it's 12 feet high and 20 feet wide, 20 feet long. And it dominates the room when you come in. And there's a reason for it, because the idea is to incorporate you into the picture. But the picture is important because of what it portrays. And I'm just going to indicate some things. If you look at the front of the boat, the person that is in the front clearing away ice is a backwoodsman from one of the colonies. It could be South Carolina or it could be Vermont. Next to him, in the Scottish caftan, is a new immigrant that's come from Scotland, and you see him moving ice with the oar in your front. Immediately behind him is a black man. He is a man of African extraction, and what he's wearing is the coat of the Marblehead Fisherman. These were the fishermen that were organized by Colonel John Glover, that were the way that Washington escaped New York earlier in 1776, and the way that he got across the Delaware. They were some of the most skilled fishermen and skilled oarsmen in the world. And they were a unit made up of Africans, freed American slaves, and then free men who were Americans, and of course whites. So that's who that is. That's one of the Marblehead fishermen from the state of Maine/Massachusetts, that area. Washington, of course, is there. He's the next one you see. That's Virginia. And then behind him is Virginia, too. Who's holding that flag is the 18-year-old James Monroe, who will become the 5th president of the United States. Immediately in front of them, they're looking out with the gloves, the man with the gloves and the black oiled hat. He's much better off than the other people in the boat. He's part of Smallwood's regiment from Maryland. Then above him is another frontiersman. I can't identify exactly what state that is. Then in the red garment there behind the Smallwood's regiment man is probably a woman who is in the Revolution. There were many women who fought in the American Revolution. They dressed as men and they got in the Revolution. Behind her there holding his hat, that man is from Hazlitt's regiment in Delaware. In the boat then you see two farmers from Pennsylvania. And one of them is holding a kind of a shotgun. The other one is very ill. You can see him. And then finally, you have the backwoodsman moving the boat at the back. I just wanted to quickly reference this, but this was painted by Emanuel Leutze, who was a German who was an abolitionist, but he was also trying to send a message to people who had just failed in an attempt to make a revolution in 1848 in Germany. And the concept was don't lose hope because of what Washington was able to do and his band at Trenton on Christmas night of 1776. What that involved was that 90% of the American forces had been wiped out, or had been lost, or had defected that Washington was commanding, that is. between approximately August of 76 and December of 76. Left with approximately 3,000 people, Washington chose to do something, which was to attack the British and specifically the Hessian contingent, the German contingent from the state of Hesse, who were not, they were employed, they were indentured, if you want to put it that way. They were conscripted and were German fighters. They were formidable. They were very dangerous, but they were at odds with the colonists because they were being paid. And so what happened was that Washington decided to make a kind of a last stand. And the watchword for this was victory or death. And that's what people knew when they got in the boats. And what this shows, and by the way, this is an actually realistic scene in the sense of the ice flow. Obviously, you're not standing in a boat as you're going across it in that way. But that's done, of course, for both dramatic and metaphorical purposes. But importantly, this attack, which did occur, in which Washington had about 1,000 people under his immediate command, and then there were other persons commanding other parts of the army, was successful. And in that attack, Washington lost no one through the battle. There was a person that froze to death. There were a couple of other losses. So when people talk about the American Revolution and people talk about the concept of the Declaration of Independence, or we talk about the concept of the Constitution, everybody was in it. Everybody was in it. And many people took different sides in different ways. But what we want to propose is that this is actually the circumstance that the globe finds it in today. When the first Bretton Woods system was created back in 1944, there were no truly free nations in Africa, for example. There are now 54 nations in Africa, in that continent. There was no India represented at the table because that was still a colony of the British. And it would not have its independence until 1947. There was no Pakistan either. And then, of course, the issue of China. China was still, first of all, involved in a civil war, but also what the final even shape of China was still in dispute because of the Japanese invasion. The Soviet Union was in shambles, and so and was certainly not part of the system as such in the way in which it was being shaped. However, the important point is that a new Bretton Woods system, a system that would create economic development and economic security as the basis for military security. This is what has to be created for the world as a whole now. A new, just form of world economic order. The United States could have played and did play under Roosevelt a certain role in creating the conditions for that kind of broader based in economic justice. And you can see that in part in MacArthur's command of the nation of Japan. But to really do that in the way in which it would be required today is going to require that we basically overturn most of the axioms that people believe about history, about the current history, and about what their actual options are for changing history. Historical change should be something which is very simply native to America. That if you simply were to read or understand that the sentences there that say merely that when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bands that have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes of their separation. And that's why there's a declaration, because of the decent respect for the opinions of mankind. It was mankind as a whole that had organized itself to make that revolution. People were involved from all over the world, whether they were from Poland or Germany or from various other countries. And as for the Africans and African Americans who would become Americans at the point that this would occur, yes, there was the unresolved question of slavery, but you have to realize that there have been people of African descent in the country before 1619, but certainly by 1619 in the form of chattel slavery, also indentured servants. Some of those people have purchased their freedom and earned their freedom as early as the 1690s. So there were Americans who were of African origin who were free men for 80 years, even as much as a century before the American Revolution. And whether we're talking about people like Agrippa Hall of Vermont, or we're talking about James Forten of New York, or we're talking about Prince Hall in Massachusetts, or we're talking about other people like Peter Williams or Peter Salem or other people that participated in the revolution. James Armistead Lafayette, who was the intelligence officer and counterintelligence officer for Lafayette, who was about 20 years old at the time that James Lafayette served with him. These were Americans of African descent that fought on the side of the Patriots. There were tens of thousands of Americans of African descent that fought on the side of the British. But the point is, everybody was in the revolution. Everybody fought, everybody that cared about or took a stand or was caused to take a stand on this was involved. This is a rich, varied, complex history that Americans need to know, because what came out of it, what was invented coming out of it, was what is sometimes called the American system. This was an invention of Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton, with Hamilton being the person that was the writer of the various reports that he did as Secretary of Treasury, the American first Secretary of Treasury, on manufacturers, on the National Bank, and on public credit. And it is that which is the core of the successful American Revolution, not the battles. It was the establishment of the economic system, which is not the system of Adam Smith. It's not the system of free enterprise. It's called the American system, and is something established by Hamilton and by a series of other economists, Matthew Carey, his son Henry Carey, the German economist Friedrich List, and many others. And that tradition was rediscovered during the 1970s by this movement, by associates of Lyndon LaRouche, such as Alan Salisbury and others. And it's been something we've been fighting to try to get America back to and forward to since that time. And so the point is, the solution is known. The American Declaration of Independence requires, as it says, if a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces the desire to reduce a people under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. But what that means is that the American Constitution, preamble particularly, and the American Declaration of Independence are themselves revolutionary documents. Knowing them and practicing them tells you how to change government. This is not a question of making violent revolutions. It's not a question of some large-scale overthrow of this or that. It's a question of understanding these principles and how to apply them. And that is what we will be discussing next Sunday at 1 p.m. And you can help us get people, make themselves available, if you will, to really understand why there is a July 4th in the United States. It has very little to do with American jingoism, chauvinism, narrow-mindedness, parochialism, or any of the things that you associate, frankly, unfortunately, either with the holiday or with Americans. It has to do with this broader universal principle, which was fought through and imperfectly implemented, and then gradually perfected as time went on through other occasions. And this is what we are saying that people have to learn, is that they stop asserting that people have some perfected system they are putting forward. And if they are not perfect in their perfection of that system and their implementation of that, there's something wrong. That's a lie. That's always the condition of people. People are always putting forward things which are better than they are if those ideas are important. And so it is to celebrate the concept of what we have to do now internationally that we're asking people to join us next Sunday at 1 p.m. As I said, there will still be a show on Saturday at 2, but that's not the main event. The main event is Sunday at 1 p.m. That will be a Schiller Institute conference, and we hope to see you there. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank you all for joining us for the Manhattan Project meeting today, and we'll see you here next Saturday, as well as, importantly, next Sunday, 1 p.m.